Hello, very beautiful community. Let me know if we've got sound and let me know if we have got a picture. So, what we're going to do now is going to be more about you because uh, for health reasons, I couldn't do a main channel video today, but I aim to do one tomorrow. So, that'll be more my reaction and my thoughts about what are the big picture takeaways. This is a bit of an emergency live in which I'm going to react to your questions as they come in. So we've got sight and sound, which is always a good start, beautiful community. So let's rock and roll. I'm going to scroll up and take a couple of your questions, and it's via your questions that we might react, sort of, and build up a big picture sense of what's going on. I do have to say that nothing new is happening in terms of the kinds of realignment of the world that we're thinking about. We've got the United States engaged in two dynamics that are really an expression of the same process. The United States is expanding its power in its supposed sphere of influence, while withdrawing and retreating practically and strategically from its global presence. So we're looking at US power in decline, but a feature of US power in decline is the realignment of US power onto a focus on a sphere of influence, precisely of the kind that, for instance, Vladimir Putin would love the United States to realign itself around. And what's very interesting is that small picture style, this is not good news for Putin. But big picture style, this is excellent news for Putin because it's part of a strategic realignment that Putin would look forward to. It's less good in other ways because Putin is just very allergic to the kind of picture we've seen of Maduro captured, because Putin is terrified that might happen to him. Let's take a few questions, beautiful community, and keep telling me if you are having any problems with picture and sound. So we've got with a new computer and the new mic setup, but I'm not tried a new software yet, which will be the third step to make sure that we don't have these sound cutouts that we had at the beginning of several of our last lives. Echelon, in case there is room for a question, is the lack of dealing with Maduro's regime in its entirety the usual Trump oversight, or is it a strategy that allows for regional chaos that the US could later exploit? So the United States could not deal with Maduro's regime in its entirety, because as the United States should have learned several times over, but it won't learn this, decapitation of regimes is not the same as breaking the connection between the regime and the state. The Maduro regime is very much interconnected with the functionality of the state. And so the preservation of the Maduro regime is something that dramatically overlaps with the preservation of how the state functions there. Removing Maduro doesn't change this. So there's nothing the United States could have done to break this, short of literally a full-scale invasion and setting up governance there in old-style colonial form. Having said this, it's not that there is any reflection on the after on Trump's part for a couple of reasons. One is that it's Trump's personality to like the theatrics of war rather than sustained war and what needs to follow it, the after plan. Trump's interested in the theatrics. Rather the way Putin is interested, interestingly, in the process of negotiations. Putin's in love with the process of negotiations, but it doesn't mean Putin wants to seriously negotiate. So Trump's in love with the sort of pictorial marvelousness of dramatic military acts. He's not in love with sustained military acts, and certainly he's not in love with what comes after. That's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is that this is largely an operation about demonstrating that the United States will apply its big stick, at least regionally, when it wants to. There is no systematic idea there for what's going to happen after. And when Trump was pressed on that, he just referred back to people standing behind him, like Mark Rubio. But Mark Rubio hasn't got a clue about what's going to happen after, nor does he have any control over it. I'm going to go more quickly now. EU leaders, what should they do? Orly Sator is asking. How should they react? And at what point is the cost of not standing up to its stated values worse than the short-term military benefits, or of being aligned with the United States? So this is a collective action problem, right? I mean, if Kaya Kallas called me this morning, I obviously don't give advice to politicians in the performance of their political duties, because that would take away my impartiality. But if somebody who was a more junior version of Kai Kallas called me and said, "Well, what do I do?" It's no good telling them to draw a line and make a statement that the US action is completely unacceptable. Because either you have a situation where the Europeans are aligned on this, or you don't. Saying that they are aligned on this when they're not is not a useful exercise, right? So it wouldn't be good if Kai Kallas came out today and said the US action is a disgrace. Now, what Kai Kallas did say is itself a disgrace, not a disgrace for her, but a disgrace um, in the sense that the state of our institutional incapacity in Europe is a disgrace. Kai Kallas said that we're monitoring the situation closely. And as this situation escalated, the position of the Europeans was to escalate the degree to which they monitored it closely. And now they've captured Maduro. Well, if they've captured Maduro, that's it. Now we are escalating our monitoring to the most serious level of close monitoring anybody has ever seen. So the problem is you can't, as a single actor, just come out and tell off the United States. You need some strategic European capacity behind you. And imagine getting European leaders to agree on that. It would be quite impossible. We've had some condemnation of Trump, ironically, on the French far right, but it's difficult to get Keir Starmer to criticize Trump. Keir is overwhelmed. His government is dramatically unpopular. He is scared of everything coming his way. And then there's this Venezuela issue, which is on the other side of the world. For goodness sake, let it just pass and let me not say anything too embarrassing about it. That's what most of them can do at the limit. So it's not possible for a single leader to just apply language to the situation and say, yes, Europe is going to finally take a stand. No, you need democratic capacity. You need leaders to be less overwhelmed in their domestic situation, to be able to take time and be more strategic and more assertive on the international stage. When there is extreme domestic overwhelm and you are just sort of desperately trying to bat the ball onto the other side of the net in your domestic politics and hope you can stay on the court, and the others are in the same situation, you're not going to be able to get together and create a European strategic vision practically followed through, which says, look, the United States is a rogue actor, it's an unpredictable actor, and if there's going to be a world of spheres of influence, we need our own sphere of influence. So what the Europeans should do, right, is come out and condemn Trump. But In practice, it's very difficult to put together a picture of agency where you could, without taking the piss out of people, actually say, you and you come out and make that statement. Because the statements, if they're made by individual actors, is not going to do it, not going to do anything. So that's the problem of collective action. So I would say that it's not incompetence on behalf of European leaders, it's a sort of incapacity that they are watching the situation so closely. And of course, the Ukrainians are in a farcical position here because if they criticize Trump, that's a win for Putin. If they support Trump, that's also a win for Putin because they're supporting Trump doing something that is different, but also similar to the kind of thing Putin did in Ukraine. PGR is making an interesting point. The obviously illegitimate Maduro occupying Venezuelan government is illegally gone. You can argue about the motivation and legality of the removal, but I can't help feel this is a net positive. So this is not a net positive for the global order, which is the central kind of net positive we should be thinking about. You get in a South America expert, a Venezuela expert, to tell you that this is a net positive comfortably. It's not. That's not clear that it is. That the damn regime is still in place, and Trump has zero interest, as we have seen today, in elevating the democratic forces, right? So domestically in Venezuela. So first of all, you can't argue whether it's legal or illegal. It's not legal, contrary to what the uh, post-truth Twitter account of JD Vance says. Um, you also can't argue about the fact that Maduro is an illegitimate calamity that's ruinous for his country. But it doesn't follow that an external US led removal of him makes the situation for Venezuelans better. You've got to be able to keep two things in mind, right? An absolute disgrace of a tyrant has been removed, okay, authoritarian disgrace removed, but it doesn't follow that things get better from this point on, unless it's a domestically driven democratic removal of the authoritarian disgrace. Alex, do you think this is something substantively new? No, it isn't. Um, or is this an acceleration of an existing trend? I don't think it's an acceleration of an existing trend. It's the existing trend proceeding as is, which is in the United States sort of a twofold trend. One is the United States is um, converting toward a politics of spheres of influence, regional spheres of influence. And the second is the United States is drifting dangerously toward becoming an illiberal power in the 2030s. And so there are going to be many steps on each of these paths. So I see this neither as substantively new nor an acceleration of anything. This is just sort of us on schedule, if you like, coming out of the, well, now coming out of the exit from the bay, a little bit further out into the open water, if you like. Somebody's saying, well, how do I react to people celebrating this who dislike Maduro? You just admit that Maduro is an illegitimate disgrace. And then you discuss what does and what doesn't follow from the illegitimate disgrace being removed via what is itself, uh, a rogue action by the president of the United States. So don't debate Maduro, right? So it's not a conversation about who's the baddie here. Debate the consequences, what happens after. And what happens after is not set up to look pretty as things stand. And also realize this is, of course, important for the people of Venezuela, but we have to be realistic. This is important also for billions of people around the world. It affects Taiwan, it affects Ukraine. So, in the scheme of, for example, the European powers making the argument that it's worth supporting Ukraine, in that scheme of things, this is It's not good. It doesn't help this argument at all. Krum v. Sis says international relations have been throwing back a few millennia. The 19th century will be enough as an analogy. But in some ways, our predicament is worse than 19th century power rivalry. Do things change for Greenland now? Uh, Rune is asking. Yeah, you're less comfortable. Because what does Rubio do today? He says, look, we've got to take the actions of the President of the United States uh, as showing that his words matter, that what he says is going to be followed by stuff he does. And if you are Canadian or Danish, in Greenland, if you're in Mexico, you don't like hearing that, understandably. Toad, thank you very much. No amazing Trump impressions today, unless I sneak some into the main channel video. I hope to do for tomorrow, UK, about evening time, with the sort of bigger picture takeaways. Okay, now I've caught up with the early questions. Let's have a look where we are. Are there super thanks? Yes. Chester saying, what about the notion of Cuba being next? The Cuban regime is precarious. TKM is saying, how much does a lust for greatness and glory play into the reasoning behind this? When you've got somebody with a narcissistic personality disorder, nothing they do is going to be outside of that. And this absolutely affects, you know, the news story as we are witnessing it. Notice how much Trump is immersed in the theatrics of this. We haven't done anything like that since the Second World War. We've done many attacks, he said. Great attacks, but this could be the best of them all. So he loves that. What he doesn't love is thinking strategically. He doesn't love receiving advice. He doesn't love finding out new things about the country that he's raided. So I think that lust for greatness and glory is okay, but it'd be sort of better to substitute it a little bit more prosaically by thirst for narcissistic supply. Why does Trump seem to do no is asking controversial things before weekends? Well, don't rule out the possibility that Trump is, you know, always liable to do something to distract from, you know, local politics, to distract from the latest, uh, uh, you know, step of the Epstein saga, for example. Chester. Trump's threatened NATO members like Canada and Denmark is using the military against Venezuela politically easier than against these countries. Yes, of course. Or is this a false assumption? Think of the taboo, right, on Trump grabbing, you know, Greenland or something, as something that gets dissolved via a series of disinhibiting acts. Now, words are acts in politics, so just saying things normalizes these actions to some degree. And then actions of this kind further normalize them, right? So all of um, the US allies traditionally, which have been threatened by the Trump administration, are right to think that their security is more precarious now. However, we don't want to overstate that case. It's just a little bit, a tiny bit more precarious, right? This is a process. What I think would be more accurate to say is that what you are worrying might be true for US Western allies, while being a tiny bit true for US Western allies, is more true for Central American and South American countries in general. If you are there and the Trump administration is in power, your sovereignty is more precarious now. And we have seen this, you know, demonstrated in the last 24, 48 hours. How will allies and adversaries alike view the US violating international law? International law, nobody's going to care that much about. Violating the sovereignty of nations. Um, uh, this certainly has consequences. It's going to get you know, the allies and foes of the United States to take seriously that it could engage in more actions of various kinds, for instance, in Iran. Um, if you have to generalize about this, um, for Canadians, for Europeans, um, this means we've got to decouple from the United States at an accelerated pace, but how? Right? So you've got to decouple in every way that you sustainably can, but not rush it. Um, for the Chinese and the Russians, um, it says that it's now easier to get away with certain things. Now, for the Chinese, it might say that it's going to be, easier for them to get away with taking an action in Taiwan. For the Russians, it's not going to mean that much for now because they've already done what they're going to do, what they're going to do in Ukraine. But it certainly sends a kind of a frustrating message to the Kremlin, namely, damn it, if only we could have done this more effectively, we would have got away with it. And that is true, right? If Russia had managed to take over Ukraine in 3 days, the consequences that it would have suffered would have been relatively minor compared to the consequences it suffered with a prolonged multi-year war. Now, what I would say is that there are some differences between Ukraine and Venezuela, namely that while Zelensky was very unpopular when Russia invaded, extremely unpopular, he was legitimate. That's a very important distinction, right? Just because most people dislike their leader in a relatively democratic country doesn't mean they're illegitimate. Zelensky was clearly legitimate. And it was not at all, the will of the people that it'd be okay for him to get removed by the Russians. That's not the case in Venezuela. We've got an illegitimate and unloved authoritarian on the whole. It's got support, but he's unloved and illegitimate. So that makes it easier for the United States, and that's a difference. But then the other difference, of course, is that the Russians were less effective. And had they been more effective, they would have been given much more leeway, particularly by Trump administration. I do think it's time to stop talking about the liberal international order. I mean, it's really something that is more palpable in its absence than in its presence now. Because even the countries that would like to speak out in favor of it, like many European powers, can't back up their words. Alex is saying, I'm paying attention to implications for the liberal international order, domestic US checks and balances, Venezuelan stability, and all three parts of paying attention to conditions for political violence. Am I missing anything vital? No. Um, you're not. You need to focus on democratic decline in the United States, and you need to focus on a kind of a realignment of the global disorder towards something that resembles a sphere of influence politics. Um, and then you need to focus, of course, on what happens domestically in Venezuela. Um, that's about it. I mean, the central story here is the increasing unpredictability of the world's major power. You know, the central story here is that U.S. foes and U.S. allies are sitting there and they don't know what the U.S. is going to do next. And that is not good for you as global power. I shouldn't comment, Doug, on the details of the legal pursuit of Maduro on U.S. soil because I think it needs a bit more expertise than I have. Um, won't the Kremlin be concerned that they can't rely on getting a head start via the U.S. having to pretend to respect international law anymore? Um, No, because they would love the US to reset itself on a sphere of influence, might is right politics, and with that position, be in conflict with the Europeans who are too weak to even properly stand up for themselves in that conflict. Can and will Russia attempt to counter US rule in Venezuela? And we're not looking at US rule in Venezuela. And no, Russia neither can nor will attempt to counter it in any significant way. Um, on issues like these, when things are very hard for the Russians, they just step back and focus on another part of the world or another issue. How would Russia react if Putin were captured in a similar manner by the US or another country? It would lead to a radicalized politics of succession. In other words, the successor would be worse than they would otherwise be if Putin went via biological reasons. Cocklall, would you expect Trump to install a transitional government? I expect Trump to do nothing to support and to do much to hamper the elevation of democratic forces in Venezuela. I don't see how Trump sets up a transitional government. Okay, let's fish for some questions in the regular chat section. What is stopping the United States from forcing regime change in Ukraine in a pro Russian way? Paddy is asking. Um, the constellation of balance and forces in US domestic politics um, is for now going to ensure that some ways Trump could leave Ukraine out really exposed to the elements he won't quite do. However, if via some miraculous capacity, which they currently lack, the Russians could do this to Zelensky, Trump would just largely applaud how effectively they managed to do it, and that's it. Do we take it for granted that the midterms will be a disaster? Well, the midterms will be a situation where you have contestation about legitimacy, right? Because the worse um, Trump perceives himself to have done, the more he will claim that everybody else, individually and institutionally, is not legitimate. Trump does not accept the results of elections that he doesn't like. How far will the US military follow Trump? Um, Today, not very far, right? If Trump wanted to become dictator of the United States, he would struggle. Um, would that be the same in 2040 if somebody else tried? Not necessarily. At the moment, there is too much uh, pluralistic um, institutional checks and balances um, for Trump to cross certain lines. Where are the balls of the EU? Supernas is asking. Um, I don't think it's about balls. It's about the capacity, as we said earlier, to um, uh, arrive at a strategic vision and back it up. And what I am saying, like a broken record, is that our democracies are too weak and our uh, domestic leaders are too besieged at home for that to be a realistic enterprise for them. How serious is Trump about Greenland? Bjarni is asking. I mean, I wouldn't quite separate into two distinct boxes what Trump says and what he thinks. What usually Trump thinks is a mush. He doesn't have that many clear thoughts in his head that are sustained. Um, it's almost that the main thing he thinks about is about what it would be better to say on a particular day. And that's how he is proceeding. The trouble, however, in politics is that speech, if you don't follow up on it, has a disinhibiting effect, which then impacts political action. Is democratic rule in Venezuela conceivable? Conceivable, yes, but that's not what's on the agenda in realistic terms right now. So basically, Trump kidnapped me and Diego is saying kidnapped Maduro to get his hands on oil for his personal gains. Well, there's going to be a multiplicity of causes there, but essentially, Trump, yes, kidnapped Maduro for personal gain, and that almost the central cause there was actually that. Look, I can do this, and if I don't like you, know that I could do this to you. So be careful. Trump knows he lost in 2020. So Trump clearly knew he lost in 2020, um, because that's obvious anyway. And he came out in certain podcasts and actually said that he lost by accident. And I said, "Oh, I didn't mean that." However, don't underestimate how far um, power and excessively unchecked power, plus the repetition of the same story, convinces you that whatever you say is true, especially with somebody like Trump, who is not a systematic thinker and who just sort of floats on instinct and dispositional states which come and go. So don't underestimate the sincerity there by now. It's not quite my expertise. I'm so sorry to say what happens to Maduro next. Is it possible to tell, Thimble is asking, how much of the strikes and capture of Maduro are driven by Trump versus hawkish voices in his administration like Rubio? I think what has happened is very funny, and that's that there's a fleeting overlap between the neoconservatives, the neocons in Trump's administration, and the standard might is right MAGA hyper neoliberalism, as I call it. The idea that um, the strongest acts and the strongest prevails if they are the strongest, and that's not inevitable only, but also good. Um, Now, on China, the neocons want the Trump administration to be more aggressive than it is. On Russia, the neocons want the Trump administration to be much more aggressive than it is. I mean, Rubio's beside himself about the Ukraine policy. But Rubio is a disgrace because he has prioritized power over a minimal elementary standard of decency. And so he has to stand by a policy that he thinks is terrible, a policy of not just excessive accommodation of the Kremlin, but positive, enamorment with the Kremlin. So the neocons have a very small set of reservations for action. And that might be Iran, that might be Venezuela, but they have to shut up on China and particularly on Russia. And so there is this kind of temporary overlap between the neoconservative and the hyper neoliberal position in the Trump administration, and it's expressed in this action. Matt, thank you. Let's run 7 more minutes to 45 minutes. And then I am going to think more deeply, beautiful community, and give us a bigger picture take on this European time tomorrow evening, health allowing on the main channel. So watch out for that. Go to the main channel, click the bell button if you haven't clicked it already. CR Mathny, please don't feel awful and spiral. Um, Might is right is scary. But, you know, we are still in an historical moment that is a good minus historical moment, trending downward, but it's still a good minus historical moment relative to most of what human beings, including our own countries in the West, have been through over the last century. So I think that one of the things we really struggle with is that the trend is down and we can make the trend less bad, but we can't completely eliminate it. And that's a kind of powerlessness that is almost inconceivable to us. It feels strange and unnatural to us because we're used to the zigzag view of history that things get better and that the future generations will have it slightly better than we do. And so it's a sort of a head, you know, it's a head F word situation because it's just breaking a little bit our conceptual scheme about how history is supposed to go. That's what's hard about it. But uh, eventually, over the next couple of years, most people who struggle with this in this community will learn to keep two things in mind: that we can do a lot to slow down the negative trend and partly reverse it, and that the negative trend is there in the way that we can't just simply press the cancel button on it. At the moment, we're still partly not doing enough to mitigate the trend because we fantasize about the cancel button that's not there. We want to say, well, it's the irrationality of voters plus Russian interference that's sort of lurching North America and Europe toward post conservative right populism. We try to blame it on the other side, without understanding there are social forces that are driving this, which we need to take seriously and to which we need to be responsive. We need to understand how certain things have, struck citizens negatively, and we need to be uh, ready to admit that, ready to act on it, and not just dismiss Trump voters as a bunch of people who are simply irrational or malevolent. Um, and that's something we do primarily not because we are so keen to demonize the other side. We primarily do it because we want certainty in an age which is never going to give us the level of certainty we want. And so we want some kind of just a button that says eject from this historical phase. And what will happen to most people in this room who are still reaching it is that 5 years from now, you'll settle a bit and you'll recognize that there are good things that we can work on, there are bad things we can fix, there are bad things we can't do anything about. But that's the reality of where we are, and you'll stop looking for the button. If I tell you to stop looking for the button, that's not going to help either, because it's not being told to stop looking for the button that'll make you stop looking for the button. What will make you stop looking for the button is a kind of acceptance of the fact that there's a gap between reality and your blueprint for reality that's creating a very unbearable mismatch at the moment. Um, and eventually, the rigidity of this mismatch will soften. And what I'm going to be here to make sure happens is that in the softening of this mismatch, we don't encourage ourselves to just lapse into apathy and say, "Oh, for goodness sake, I'll just give up on the whole story." And that the loosening of this mismatch should actually lead to us becoming more constructively engaged, becoming more effective citizens. At the moment, most people who are aware of what a calamity Trumpism is are too much in "I can't deal with this" or "I'm panicking" mode to think like effective citizens would. And you can't blame them, because you can't blame ourselves, because we don't really have any leadership. I mean, imagine that you were thinking to vote for, Bernie Sanders or some kind of more centrist Democrat in recent years. You're terribly worried about what Trump is doing. Who's your leader now? Um, it's not clear. You can follow Gavin Newsom on social media or whatever, but you don't quite have a leader who is articulating something positive that's an alternative to Trump that could be actionable. There's a few people beginning to challenge Trump, but you don't have an articulation of an alternative that you could follow. So you're a bit epistemically lost, and you have to sort of make reality make sense for yourself. And it's hard. It's also hard being terribly opposed to something, but having no, alternative sort of courses of action. What can I do about this? This is very dispiriting. It's very alienating. But it's important to understand that, um, you know, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, if you're in a Western country, you're still gonna have the possibility to be an efficacious citizen, and you should take advantage of that rather than just float. I have ranted too much. Let's go a tiny bit longer. Alex says he'd love a chat on the philosophy of history. Well, there are several questions here. There's a question about the philosophy of history. There's then a question about the history of philosophy. And there's a question of the interaction of philosophy and history. That three distinct but related questions. How do we save the political right in the West? Um, so that's not an irrelevant question relative to what we're talking about today, because it's the absence of a responsible political right in the US that has generated the MAGA calamity. Now, you might say, look, some neocon Republican president may have done this in Venezuela too, and that's absolutely fair. But they wouldn't be degrading US institutions domestically in the way they are. So, uh, what I would say is that I don't think you can save the conservative, responsible conservative right in the West. I think it is essentially dying for the foreseeable future. Because to challenge the ex conservative right, you're going to need a degree of radicalism that is constitutively incompatible with the renormalization thesis that you just stuck with if you're a constitutional conservative. Let's come back to respecting our institutions. It's a wonderful position. It's an irrelevant position today, because you can't generate respect for institutions on moral grounds if it's gone. You can regenerate it partly by saying, I'm going to take on the economic exclusion that's partly caused this. I'm going to take on the various sort of processes of atomization in our society that have caused this. I'm going to take on the state of our public squares. I suppose if you were to challenge, if I were to just contradict myself and challenge what I've said, I'd say this: the only way constitutional conservatism can be a major force in the West today, if it somehow finds a way to be radical. But it's not radical to say what Arnold Schwarzenegger is saying now, which is, well, old conservatism good, Trumpian post conservatism bad. We took a bad turn, let's go back. That doesn't work. Because part of the reason that we've taken this bad turn is that there was a backlash against the thing you want to renormalize as back to. So it's not going to work. So there's, I suppose, some room for constitutional conservatism, but it is essentially a dead project on a large scale, over the next couple of decades at least, because it just doesn't have the material. It's not a wrong ideology. It's an ideology. It's important, and it has some ways of richly illuminating our politics and human nature. It has some very significant deficits, the way it leaves people out and so on. But there's just not enough space for it unless it finds ways to be radical, and the ways in which it can find recourse to radicalism are very limited for it. It's too natural for it to just want a reversion to the old conservatism that has broken down for non-contingent reasons. In other words, it's not just because somebody came and broke it. It broke down because social forces were against it. So it's difficult. So we're really living through a temporary age of conservative collapse. Centrist radicalism, somebody is asking. I think that the radicalism that we're going to get, that's going to work to counter these anti-institutional authoritarians, is going to borrow from all over the old ideological spectrum. And in some of these cases, we'll be able to say, wow, we don't even know if this thing is left or right. Perhaps it's both. Adamski, thank you. Do I think Newsom is the best pick for the Dems? I don't want to stray too much from Venezuela. We've contradicted ourselves and we've run a bit longer. So let's run to the full hour then and then stop. Um, at the moment, Newsom is good at this counterpunch. He's not got a clear vision for the country. That's an alternative. Um, this is an age of acceleration. Things happen very quickly. It is possible that somebody could develop a kind of political proposal over a 6-month period that they don't currently have. So we need to watch this. This is an age. So I want to repeat this point because it's so important, beautiful community. This is an age in which what used to take 5 to 10 years before can happen in 6 to 12 months. So this is not just an age of change, it's an age where part of what is changed is the pace of change. Lisa, this would be way harder without you. Thank you. And I'm sorry, and I sometimes sound really strict and mean when I say, "Oh, we've got to wake up to this, we've got to wake up to that." Um, when you're reacting to this and you're kind of realizing that, oh my word, I'm finding this a little bit harder than others, understand that others are probably finding things harder than you in other respects of their response to politics. Um, so understand that we are all individuals, and some things are easier for some of us and harder for others. And very often, what's easy for me will be hard for you, and what's hard for you might be easy for me. I think I got this the wrong way around, but you know what I mean. Things that are difficult for me might be easier for you. Things that are difficult for you might be easier for me. So you've got to be gentle on the part of you that wants to be ungentle with you over this and says, for goodness sake, why can't you get your act together and accept what's happening and react to it as an effective citizen rather than freaking out. It's right for some people to freak out for a certain period of time because what you don't want to do is find your feet with this in a way that is artificial for you. I get an enormous amount of correspondence, and I'm in 2026 trying to increase my response rate. But a big percentage of the correspondence, probably in the low double digits as a percentage point, is Vlad, can I borrow your way of coping with politics? You seem to cope with it well. Um, how do I internalize that? How do I put that inside myself? And the answer is we can be inspired by the solutions of others to problems we experience in common, but we can rarely internalize the solutions of others. We have to develop our own. There are some solutions that are working brilliantly for me, but if you put them into yourself, they would be artificial, partly because they wouldn't be quite right for you. And either substantively or procedurally, because it's not you who's arrived at them in an organic way. So it's very important that we challenge our self help industry in this way, which wants to sell us universal solutions for ourselves, how to have the perfect morning or how to not freak out about a difficult political environment. These solutions are something that you develop for yourself. And it's possible that they're going to overlap closely to the solutions that work for others too. But you can't just sort of pick this up and borrow effortlessly. So in this regard, um, it's completely useless for any of you to try to borrow something in a totality that sort of I do for myself to make myself be um, uh, you know not flattened by the nature of our political environment. These are personal solutions that it's okay for them to take time for you. It's also okay to take, damn breaks from politics too. Okay, enough ranting. How do I? Okay, continuation of the same question. Let's try it. How can I balance the urge for apathy and the pain from reality? Um, by admitting how citizens in your country, even the citizens you most dislike politically, are motivated by, among other things, positive motives about wanting to be free, wanting to be less powerless, wanting to not be duped, wanting to not be deceived. Um, Now you might come back to me and say, well, Vlad, the fact that they want some positive things as well as having some destructive impulses, but then not get that they don't get these positive things, that's itself depressing, isn't it? So how should that inspire me? Um, and the answer there is that politics is always incremental. This is not the liberal view that you need to do incremental reform, but it is rather the view that bad things are always gradationally bad and good things are always gradationally good. With the climate crisis or with democracy, you don't lose uh, a democracy overnight. You don't, you know, fail in the face of the climate crisis overnight. Um, this is a matter of degrees. With the climate crisis, literally a matter of degrees. Every point one of a degree is going to mean many, many lives. Do you care about lives? If you care about lives and livelihoods, you care about every point one of a degree difference in global heating. Um, Same with democracy. Um, you know, the degree to which you have a functional democracy uh, is very variable. It's a matter of many, many gradations. You want that gradation situation to be as positive as possible. So every little thing makes a difference. Um, but I think then think about that clash between the blueprint and reality as it is, and reflect on whether you might not be too caught up in expectations from history that are a product of the recent past rather than a more balanced sense of the past in general, which might lead you to think that we have huge challenges. But you know, our challenges are also bearable relative to the challenges of the past. There is a lot else going on here, and that is that we're less resilient than past humans. We have various kinds of crises going on. We have, among other things, some things we actually got interrupted about when we spoke about it on the live recently. We have a crisis of men. Um, we have a huge crisis of resilience in men too. We'll talk about that. So I think we also need to understand that it's not a personal failure in our culture, but there are actually some collective problems we're experiencing about resilience. And when you experience problems with resilience, it's no good to just say be resilient. It doesn't help. Um, so we need to reflect on where this is coming from, and I promise we'll talk about that too. I'm rambling, but a few things thrown at the canvas. Okay, let's say a few political things in the next couple of minutes, and then we'll reconvene on the other channel, on the main channel tomorrow. I've always believed that societies work best when there's a balance of conservative and liberal thought among its people. Is this justified? Um, it's justified if there is enough um, convergence on certain issues between these different people. Um, but if there isn't much convergence, then we've got a polarization that is inevitably going to undermine democracy. Um, I mean, it's too long to discuss now, but I'd roughly say that's a sentiment that was definitely true 10, 20 years ago, um, depending on what we mean by a good balance. But I'm not sure it's true today. Um, it's not that we have two or three camps in our society that just need to be properly balanced out against each other ideologically. What we have is a kind of complete epistemological calamity where people don't know what they think. So I suppose what you're saying is a projection onto our reality of a kind of a coherence of political outlook and discourse that is no longer there. It's my fault I've got us off track. I'm trying to say something about Trump and Venezuela to finish, but we might not be able to. And that's okay too. We'll reconvene tomorrow. Okay. I can't think of anything Maduro related because um, uh, I don't see the right question there that would be ideal to land on. So let me just answer a question that I did see a moment ago about something like letting go into grief, letting go into dread. Letting go into dread, no, but don't forget that grief is a temporary process with many steps in it, and it's a way of being connected to the world. It's a way of being connected to reality, actually. So don't think of grief as um, useless or depoliticized. Grief is actually a pliant mode of engagement with its own timing, with its own life, which means that you are connected to the world. Um, there are better and worse ways to grieve, and there are ways of grieving that are sort of more neurotic than others. Um, but there's such a thing as a healthy grief, and if that's what you need, take the time with it. It's what a responsible citizen and an ethically decent person does in their journey of sort of making the kind of calibration with the world that they need when the world is scary and when the world is changing. More analysis tomorrow, beautiful community. Thank you for being with me. It's not going to be a very massively well produced video on the main channel, but it'll just be an opportunity for me to give you the big picture understanding of the the way Trump's capture of Maduro and the Venezuela action is um, drifting us into new forms of international disorder. Thank you so much for being with me for this hour. Lots of love and talk very soon.